Progressivism. Progressivism is a broad term that ties together many individual reform movements of the late 1800s and early 1900s. The name progressivism implies positive change or progress, so the general definition of progressivism is a commitment to bringing about positive reform in society. Of course, this could take many different shapes depending on the individual reform movement. Before we get into examples of these, I want to talk about muckrakers. Muckraker was a nickname given to journalists during this time who were progressive reformers using journalism in order to advance a particular reform. Examples of these muckrakers include Jacob Riis, Ida Tarbell, and Lincoln Steffens. The idea was that if they were to expose the dirt or the muck that was out there, then they could attract enough attention to bring about change. Progressive reformers believed that democracy was a useful tool with which to bring about change, much like the populists believed that greater democracy would result in a more responsive government. They also emphasized efficiency and professionalism. They thought that leaders like themselves should lead the way in bringing about change. They believed that reform was necessary in order to prevent chaos. You may have heard about the need to bend in order to keep from breaking. This helps in understanding their philosophy. There were so many different reform movements during this period of history, it can be mind-boggling. But I think it will be helpful for you to divide them into 5 major categories. So, following along with the diagrams that I've provided for you, first we'll think about industry as a category. Society's problems related to industrialization. Secondly, we'll talk about reform, dealing specifically with politics, political reform. Then we'll look at women's issues. Then health and morality, which I admit is somewhat of a catch-all, a miscellaneous category. Finally, we'll talk about African Americans, reform movements specific to their problems. First of all, let's look at industrialization. As I mentioned before, immigration was very much part of the story of industrialization, and with immigration came some major problems. For one thing, remember the nativist response to immigrants. Many Americans didn't welcome new neighbors. In addition to nativism, another response was the eugenics movement. I want you to be familiar with eugenicism, or the eugenics movement. This was the idea that there are the fit and the unfit. The word eugenics itself refers to good genes. So the belief was that there were some groups of people who, often because of their ethnicity or mental traits, were supposedly more fit than others. Eugenicists believe that they should improve the gene pool in America by keeping the unfit from reproducing, whether it meant forced sterilization of prisoners or some other approaches, which we'll get to later. Of course, not everyone had the same attitude towards various ethnic groups and immigrants. We noted the settlement house movement earlier, such as the Hull House Jane Addams founded, and the idea of Americanization, helping immigrants adjust to their new lives in America. Another issue related to industrialization is child labor. This was a specific reform movement that was very important during this time, pushing for laws against employing child labor. There was also the matter of working conditions. Some reformers focused on this problem, wanting regulations to make the workplace environment safer. Living conditions, fire hazards. You can read about the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire and see how this tragedy sparked attention that eventually led to fire codes. Another example of a reform movement related to industrialization is the debate over how to handle big businesses. We've discussed the concept of monopolies and how those who were successful at building monopolies were able to squeeze out most of their competition. Progressive reformers had no trouble agreeing that this was a problem and that the progressive thing to do was to free up competition, but they disagreed about the approach to take. For example, Teddy Roosevelt thought that big business wasn't necessarily a bad thing. When you think of Teddy Roosevelt, think big. He had a big personality. He thought big business was okay, as long as it could be countered by a big government regulating it. On the other hand, Woodrow Wilson, another president, thought that big businesses were not okay. He was a trust buster. He thought that the trust had to be broken up, not simply regulated by an also big, powerful government. This also brings up the matter of socialism. The socialists, although they never made up a majority of American voters, did make noticeable gains during this period. Again, remember the emphasis of progressive reformers on the need to reform in order to avoid more drastic changes, such as socialism. Let's move on to the area of politics. Some progressive reformers focused on reform movements such as the secret ballot or the direct election of senators, some of the issues that the populists had already brought to the forefront. Some pushed for changes like the referendum and recall, more direct involvement of the American people in their government. Another example is reform in the area of political machines. Reformers like Lincoln Steffens focused on exposing the corruption of the political machines. They argued with people like George Washington Plunkitt that the machines were corrupt and they were doing harm. What about reform movements specific to women? One obvious example is the 19th Amendment, which brought about women's suffrage or the right to vote. A couple of examples of progressive reformers who were in favor of this change were Jane Addams and Alice Paul. Both of them were pushing for women's suffrage, but interestingly, they did so for different reasons. Alice Paul argued that women should be able to vote because they essentially were the same as men. They were enough alike that they should have the exact same rights. Jane Addams, on the other hand, argued that women should vote for the exact opposite reason, because they are so different from men. She believed they would bring a softer, more compassionate side to the political process, that they would show more interest in addressing problems like, for example, child labor. Then there was Margaret Sanger. She went on a crusade to spread information about birth control at a time when such activity was illegal. Hardly anyone will deny that fertility awareness is a good thing, but Sanger's work was controversial for a couple important reasons. For one, some feared that in the context of the 1920s permissive new woman, her message could promote promiscuity among unmarried people. Secondly, the motive behind her work was her commitment to eugenics, and I mentioned the eugenics movement earlier. She was a eugenicist who believed birth control should be used to keep the so-called unfit groups, such as African Americans and the poor, from reproducing. The birth control clinics she formed developed into the well-known abortion provider Planned Parenthood. Increasingly, African American women are much more likely than white women to have an abortion today, and some critics have suggested that racism still plays a role in the organization's mission. Many women participated in the progressive reform movements that weren't necessarily about women's issues. Women were a vital part of the progressive movement in every area. You can look at them as what you might call social housekeepers. They believed that it was their responsibility not just to keep their homes neat and orderly, but they believed they had an obligation to clean up the evils of society. This is a good way to transition into the next category, health and morality. In some of these areas, you can see a lot of influence by women in the progressive movement. One example is the 18th Amendment with the prohibition of alcohol. Reformers had argued previously in the temperance movement and then in the prohibition movement that many of the problems of society could be traced back to the consumption of alcohol. Whether they were concerned with problems such as domestic violence, poverty, or crime, very often alcohol was a factor. So, progressive reformers pushing for prohibition were looking at the problem of alcohol in a larger context of society's problems. Of course, we'll see later that prohibition wasn't that well enforced in the 1920s and was eventually repealed. Another example of a reform movement involves sanitation. In the matter of food and drugs, many reformers were pushing for stricter standards of safety and sanitation. A good example here is Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. Some of you may have read this in high school. Upton Sinclair was actually a socialist who wrote this story of an immigrant family coming to America and facing hardships, hoping that he would convince Americans to turn to socialism to solve their problems. That's not the effect that his book had. In fact, the most attention-grabbing portion of the novel was where he described conditions in the meat-packing plants, where they were processing meat in unsanitary conditions, with rats running around and workers accidentally having their fingers chopped off and cut up in with the meat. After he wrote this book, Upton Sinclair once said that he had aimed for people's hearts, but he had missed and hit their stomachs. So this was instrumental in pushing for more regulation in the form of the Food and Drug Act. Another example of a reform movement is conservation and preservation. Some reformers were concerned with the environment. It's important to know the difference between conservation and preservation. You can see the difference if you compare the national forest to the national park system. The national forest practices conservation. You'll occasionally see loggers in a national forest, but it's controlled logging, and a lot of attention is paid to replanting and keeping a sustainable resource. But if you visit a national park like Yellowstone, for example, you won't see logging. You're not even supposed to pick up a rock or pick a flower and take it home with you. This is an example of preservation, leaving the environment untouched. There was a family feud of sorts between the conservationists and preservationists, which you can still see going on today. But they did have much in common. Both were concerned about bringing about reform to protect the environment, only in different ways. There were also blue laws put into place. This falls under the category of morality, wanting to enforce business closings on Sundays. Our final category is reform movements specific to African Americans. As I mentioned before, lynching became quite a problem after Reconstruction in the American South. Ida B. Wells Barnett was a particular reformer who was dedicated to leading a campaign against lynching. Segregation, of course, was going on through this period, and some progressive reformers saw this as something that had to be addressed. On the other hand, others who also called themselves progressives defended segregation. They had a very different definition of progress. Some actually argued that segregation was a good thing, that if you keep white and black Americans apart, you'll avoid conflict. So here is yet another example of different definitions of progress. The right to vote, as I've said before, the 15th Amendment put into writing the African American right to vote. But in reality, there were many obstacles. Some progressive reformers were committed to changing this. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are two important reformers from this time period who both were interested in improving lives for their fellow African Americans. But they too disagreed about the definition of progress. With the Tuskegee Institute, Washington emphasized developing agricultural and technical skills so that African Americans could gradually prove themselves and improve themselves and convince white Americans that they were entitled to greater opportunities and respect. Du Bois, on the other hand, thought Washington had too conservative an approach, that African Americans should demand greater, more immediate changes like access to any college or university they wanted, careers, whether they wanted to be doctors, lawyers, or whatever. He accused Washington of working within the system too much. Both these reformers had many of the same goals in mind, but they disagreed about the proper approach to take to lead to progress. So I want you to reflect on the contested definition of progress. As you look at all of these categories and all of the individual reform movements within them, notice that a lot of people were calling themselves progressives, progressive reformers. Some of them were simply concentrating on different issues, not necessarily that they disagreed, but they emphasized different things. Some of them collaborated with one another, and some of them clashed with one another. Even sometimes while working towards the same goals, they had disagreements about the definition of progress.